Welcome to our discussion on redefining development. My name is Bill Clapp, and I'm the chairman of the board of Global Washington. For many years now, the role of the civil sector has been growing in response to the growing needs and challenges faced in developing countries around the world. Whether they come from natural disasters, displaced people, pandemic diseases, depletion or extinction of resources and species, failure of laws, or failure of governments to meet the basic needs of their citizens. Governments have found themselves often incapable of dealing with all of these challenges. They are only capable, or often only capable, of swinging a big hammer and not working with the finer details of work and challenges that are found in the field. They are constrained by economics, politics, bureaucracy, and sometimes find themselves conflicted in doing the right thing. In the meantime, business continues to globalize, and many, such as Microsoft, Starbucks, and Theo's Chocolates, realize that their success is tied to their supply chains or to new markets yet to be reached in the roughly 4 billion people who are not served efficiently by the global economy. Others work internationally, source internationally, manufacture internationally, and yet are only coming now slowly to the realization that they must also be citizens internationally and give back to the communities that host them and their work. All of these sectors are gradually realizing that they cannot do it alone and need to find partners who can help them extend their work and their influence. The development sector has made huge strides over the past 2 decades in becoming more businesslike, if you will, to communicate successfully with the business sector, to learn how to stretch their resources further, to make their work more enduring, and to be able to advocate for policy change in a competitive political environment, and as well as to be able to generate new resources for their work. All of this happens against a backdrop of increasing climate disasters, economic turmoil, upheaval in the Middle East, millions of displaced peoples, and the seemingly growing power of small cartels, gangs, and traffickers, and the growing political and religious divisions. So never has the need for effectiveness been greater than it is today, and the ability to make our case been more important. So here to discuss today the role of partnership in accomplishing this, we have 3 true experts in the fields, great guys, good friends, and just a sec, shuffle, Bill. So I'm just going to look and see what the lineup is, so I introduce them in the correct order. So immediately to my left is Ray Offenheiser, who is the head of Oxfam America. Ray is an intellectual leader and a business leader in this field that I've admired for 20 years, and we're truly thrilled to have him here. Brings a breadth of knowledge, not only on the development side, but on the political side of the work we're doing. Next to him is our own star, new movie star, starring in a joint role with Ben Affleck of building chocolate in the Congo. And you may have seen that on CBS. If not, be sure and look it up. Joe is with Theo Chocolates here and is truly a pioneer in the field of building supply chains that effectively work with the people who are doing the work on the ground. And to his left, another good friend, Amir Dossal, who unfortunately chose the name of Global Partnerships Forum for the organization he started. But Amir is truly a global citizen and has a Rolodex that any of us would kill for. He seems to sit in the center of the universe as everything swirls around and plays an amazing role with the United Nations. He is a special representative of the Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union for Global Partnerships. He is the head serves on the Commissioner of the Broadband Commission. He is the Ambassador for Peace and Sport. He has received the Humanitarian Award for the United Nations Association of New York for his accomplishments to end poverty and world hunger. Well, it goes on and on and on. I mean, this guy is just amazing because there are so many people look to him to bring people together. And so when you're talking in the sense of what partnership is, you're looking at Mr. Partnership, the man who is willing to, or is able to network people from all sectors and accomplish something. So we're going to have an interesting discussion about this. And with that, I'm going to take my seat, switch on my other mic, and I'll be right with you. Now, here I am, sitting with this distinguished panel. So let's have some fun. So I'm going to start off by asking my pal Ray to kind of lay out the framework for what you see in partnerships. Oxfam has created a lot of partnerships. You work all over the world, and you also work very much in the sphere of policy. But if you could kind of give us a framework, Ray, of what you see the issues in creating partnership in this environment today.
Great. Well, thanks, Bill. And it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you for Global Washington for the meeting today. And it's been great to sort of be reunited with Bill, and with whom I've worked over these many years. What I'd like to do is maybe just to set a frame briefly for the broad discussion we're going to try to have on. So where are we in this relationship between government, not-for-profits, and the private sector? And it's a journey that sort of began maybe 2 decades ago in the development field, 2 or 3 decades ago in the development field. But I'd like to argue that we're at an inflection point in terms of what's happening, how fast it's happening, and the kind of relationships, partnerships, and collaboration that are taking place around the world between government, not-for-profits, and the private sector. And maybe just a couple of quick facts just to kind of situate the conversation. First, I think one of the things that's really important to recognize that's happening in the world, maybe somewhat invisibly to all of us, but maybe a little bit more visibly to those of us who are in these countries, is that many years ago, if we go back 20, 30 years, and you went to many countries in Africa, basically the large contribution that represented development was funding that came from bilateral and multilateral donors. And governments had sort of MOUs or memorandum of understanding with these agencies, AID, the British and European equivalents, and that was really what the development game was all about. What's happened over the last 3 decades as globalization has accelerated is we're seeing foreign aid as a percent of foreign direct investment in many of these countries, and many even of the poorest countries, going down, down, down. Not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, while we're seeing foreign direct investment of companies going up and up and up. And we're seeing the process of globalization it becoming much more inclusive of some of the poorest countries in the world. And you're seeing extractive industries presence, you're seeing textile firms going into new markets, either to produce or to market, all sorts of companies, chocolate companies, all variety of companies with a new presence. And so what that's done is it's created some interesting challenges for the companies going into these countries. They're in strange territory. They're assuming risks they've never encountered before. They're encountering new cultures, new business cultures. And they're being challenged by governments and civil society in these countries to ask themselves, is their business model serving good development ends in that country? Are they doing good or are they doing harm? And that's generated a whole global discussion at very high levels about normative standards that maybe business should be considering in terms of their performance on the ground in the field. It's generated a variety of conversations within particular sectors that have large footprints in many of these countries about their particular role and whether it's for good or for ill. And it's caused a very deep practice discussion about supply chains. Bill mentioned this, and I think one of the things that's happening is you're finding governments and not-for-profits engaging companies around what do their supply chains look like, where is value being accumulated, how do these supply chains affect the social benefit derived by people, human development outcomes, environmental impacts, economic sort of prosperity, and all of these things. And companies are having to sort of grapple with these things, which are very, very new for them. It's generated also some new compliance standards companies are having to follow that have maybe more social development dimensions. Some companies are actually taking on the question of whether they should adopt human rights standards or human rights charters internal to their company. Coca-Cola has done that. Coca-Cola has adopted a human rights charter in the company, and now they're dialoguing with organizations like Oxfam about, well, now we did this, now how do we actually operationalize that in the field in terms of the work we're doing? So it's fast-moving, changing times. I guess I would posit we're moving to globalization 2.0, in which we're going to be thinking more about inclusive growth, about how this new private sector presence is going to be affecting human development outcomes. And I think very timely, this conference is how are we going to develop partnerships, collaboration, or what we might call multi-stakeholder initiatives to actually add value to these kinds of new possibilities of relationships between government, civil society, and the private sector. So maybe I'll stop there, Bill, just to offer that as a frame.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. Amir, from your perspective at the UN, how do you see the topics that Ray framed up playing out? Where do you see the role of partnerships going, and what progress, from your perspective, do you see or not see?
There you go. Bill, thank you very much for having us. Actually, this is a great conference, and it's exactly the kind of discussion we need to have. And I think Ray put it very succinctly. If you look back into the history, in the olden days, we used to work and rely on aid mechanisms. And the difference between aid and foreign direct investment is unbelievably amazing, actually. Today, about $100 billion is spent on foreign aid globally. Foreign direct investment runs at about $1.4 trillion, and it's growing. And aid is starting to drop, especially after the financial crisis. The budgets are being reduced, and governments are saying, look, we cannot afford to pay for another country's development. We need to take care of our own backyard. So that's that important change which is taking place, and side by side, companies are looking to say, how can I do well and do good at the same time? So in the UN, when we talk about partnerships and we talk about these kinds of engagements, I'll take you back into history a little bit. In the late 90s, Ted Turner arrived on the scene one day, and he was due to receive an award from the United Nations Association. He came to Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General, and says, and this was September of '97. He says, and by the way, just to give you a kind of a timeline perspective, in those days, we were at the height of peacekeeping operations. We had Somalia, Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, elections in Cambodia, elections in South Africa taking place, former Yugoslavia was burning, and so on. And he comes up and he says, Kofi, I was worth $3 billion in January of that year, in '97. Now I'm worth $4 billion. And that additional $1 billion really is not doing much for me. So Kofi Annan looks at him and he's saying, I wonder what's happening here. So he says, well, what I'd like to do is, I'm also sorry to tell you that my government hasn't paid its dues. I want to give you that $1 billion, then I'll sue the US government. So Kofi Annan sat and moved like this. And then he looked at me, he says, did he say 1 million? I said, no, sir. He said, 1 billion. Oh, can we take that money? And I said, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I'm afraid you cannot. Because United Nations, even though it says, we the peoples of the United Nations, it is limited to the member states of the United Nations. So we said one thing we could do is create a mechanism where Ted would create a platform, we would create a mechanism internally, so that we can use those funds for humanitarian causes. We created that foundation for him and created an office for partnerships within the UN with the one proviso, that we don't take that simply as aid, but use that for investing for social change. That led to really a multiplier of people coming to us and saying, if you work with Ted, why can't you work with us? And there were a number of organizations, foundations, as well as companies who were doing great work. You mentioned Coca-Cola. They've been at the forefront of this kind of vanguard of change. There's Pepsi, and there's the retail industry, which is doing great work in supply chain, for example. So we actually had partnerships fall onto our laps. And we built these new forms of partnerships and alliances, mixing media. For example, we used MTV and Coca-Cola to address the scourge of HIV and AIDS in Africa. Coca-Cola is the largest employer in Africa, for example. And we use the distribution system to send out literature, send out condoms through the truck drivers and the suppliers. And we use MTV to get the messages out to young people. And there are numerous examples. In fact, Microsoft created Unlimited Potential, where they help train people in the developing world with the aim that they would employ them for jobs in the future. So it was creating jobs, but also helping people build capacity locally, help Microsoft as a business model. But the bigger good was they trained hundreds of thousands of people. Cisco did the same thing. Starbucks, for example, did ethical sourcing. And what Joe is doing is exactly the type of model we need, where we think through and say, how can we create jobs in those countries? We empower people, we educate people. They become members of society. And therefore, we don't redistribute wealth, but we create wealth in those countries through these new forms of partnerships. So.
Thank you. I might add that he also managed the Ted Turner Fund for the United Nations. So from a practical level here, I mean, coming down a little bit from the UN and from international politics, to somebody who is actually in the field and is really a sort of a classic model of a business modeled social serving organization. What is your perspective on this? What are the challenges that you see in working in and with the business community, and where do you see this movement going?
Well, again, thank you for having us, and I'm really honored to be here with all of you. The Theo chocolate, and did everybody get some chocolate today? Thank you. So just to be careful, the bar that has a yellow label is really spicy. So if you don't like spicy food, trade with your neighbor, find someone who does.
Can I just ask, okay, can you hear Joe in the back all right? No? Okay, will you move your mic up just a little bit, please?
Oh.
Yeah, that's better.
That's good.
How's that? Better? Okay, great.
Thank you.
So yellow spicy, that was the main message, be careful. So for us, our model is, I think it's very, very simple, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but we believe that we have better suppliers, cocoa farmers, when they are paid well for their crop. No, thank you. But it also requires consumer engagement. And at the end of the day, it's a consumer movement. So we believe in transparency. I don't know another model like this right now, but we put all the prices that we pay for our cocoa up online for anybody to see. We also put all of our employee handbooks and employment practices up online for anyone to see, so that we can start to have a dialogue with our customers and our consumers. And I think that only makes us better. But at the end of the day, if we provide the training through our NGO partners, one of them is ECI, Eastern Congo Initiative, that helps improve the quality of the cocoa to meet our standards. So we provide technology, our partners implement, we guarantee prices for specific quality, because we can't pay more for the cocoa if consumers aren't willing to pay more. And one of the ways that they're willing to pay more for a chocolate bar is if it tastes better. So the quality of the cocoa has a big impact on that. It also helps us be more efficient. And it's a very simple business model. So consumers are engaged, the price is higher, the farmers are paid more. We're fully transparent so that we can build trust not only with consumers but with the farmers. And we implement that, and off it goes. And so the actual aid or NGO involvement is really at the beginning. But it's not something, it sunsets eventually. I mean, I think all of us sort of wished in some regards that we actually weren't here, because everybody's just fine out there. And so we have this vision of seeing the NGO involvement sunset, but it's a very simple business model. At the end of the day, it's a consumer education to help pull this through, and the investment comes in behind. Did that answer your question, or did I just go off on a tangent?
That's good.
All right.
But you're not off the hook. I'll come back. Okay. So Ray, what experience has Oxfam had in setting up partnerships with businesses that have been productive? And I believe you've done it not only on the actual side of working in countries, but also on the side of policy advocacy.
Right, that's correct. So maybe just a quick overview of how Oxfam has evolved as an organization that's working with the private sector. In the early days, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, our sort of approach to the private sector was really much more, I guess you might characterize it as adversarial. I think that was probably true of many NGOs in that era. We really didn't have internally sort of much in the way of sort of core competencies to sort of engage companies. So if we found something that we found was an issue, we would address it, we would make it public, and we might even campaign around it. Today, we've evolved toward, I guess, what I might characterize as a much more broad spectrum approach, in which we're trying to really accomplish three things. One is make certain kinds of changes, force certain kind of changes to happen that we think are important for development outcomes, leverage some kinds of changes in company policy and business practices and supply chains, and also engage in innovative activities with companies where that seems to be appropriate. And maybe just in terms of thinking about what does that mean practically, I mentioned earlier that there's a variety of fora where there's discussions around creating norms for corporate behavior. The UN's been playing an important leadership role. The Turner Foundation, the UN Foundation, is a leader in that area. But there's a lot of other work going on in industry trade associations, and that's a space we now find ourselves in. We're actually going to trade association meetings and interacting with business leaders in those fora about normative change, normative standards, also at the UN and other corporate social responsibility fora. Because we've been signaled to the private sector that we're interested in this kind of work, we've been invited into a whole lot of I guess you might call them quiet dialogues with companies that are going through transitions, embracing a lot of these kinds of new principles, but aren't ready to go public yet. And they invite us in to talk about sustainability, about corporate social responsibility, about changes in their business practices and policies, what does it mean to adopt a human rights charter, all sorts of things that are very core to our business but are new to them. And the agreements there are we don't publicize our engagement, they don't publicize our engagement either, and so those dialogues have proven to be very productive, and then they've led to significant change. We've also, in the collaboration and collective action area, have initiated what we call a variety of multi-stakeholder initiatives with companies where we're actually engaging with companies maybe around issues of innovation and product development in areas I can talk more about in detail in a moment, but for example, in one case, developing an insurance product for farmers in Africa, and in a variety of other areas. We still run adversarial campaigns, and just some examples you're probably familiar with. Some of you may have seen the movie Blood Diamonds, about the whole issue of relationship between the sale of diamonds and purchasing of weapons. Global Witness and Oxfam really ran that campaign to make that a critical issue that led to a global negotiation and the Kimberley process to sort of point out that there might be ways of sourcing diamonds responsibly that didn't drive conflict. And then finally, to Bill's point, nowadays we actually find ourselves on Capitol Hill where we've created a coalition in which we, along with about a dozen major corporations, are lobbying on Capitol Hill around climate change, climate adaptation, and resilience financing with major corporations, Starbucks here in Seattle and a number of others that you would be very familiar with nationally. So now, and we find this whole area of doing advocacy with not-for-profits and corporations going to see political representation very interesting because it's not something the politicians are used to seeing. And so it gets their attention, they show up for the meetings, and they're very interested in the kind of content that we put forward. So all new kinds of engagement that really 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. For us, it's meant developing a whole new set of competencies. We went from having no staff working on the private sector to having 15. It's led by a lawyer we got from Paul Weiss and Rifkin in New York. And then it's also meant that we've developed a whole set of other collaborations that we never had before with business schools. We have relations with Harvard Business School, Duke Business School, Northwestern, with major consulting operations that provide input for us on some of these complex product development exercises, with major law firms in New York that actually engage with us on litigation cases, where that might be something we might be including in our campaign activities. Investor groups that are maybe social investor groups that might be engaged in stockholder advocacy at annual general meetings. So a whole range of new kinds of tools and activities that are enabling us to engage corporations in a responsible way and to drive change creatively.
Thank you, Ray. Amir, picking up on that, what we've heard about is a lot of large companies getting involved in this, and some of them, which I want to come back to with Ray, is that are not ready to come out yet, if you will. But because that's a topic that we're all interested in. But there's a certain, a conflict in the minds of the development sector, I think, when you start talking about businesses. And if I don't want to pick on Coca-Cola and Pepsi because I like both their products, but their product is related to the growth in diabetes around the world, and yet they're doing a great job on the supply chain thing. So there's sort of a conflict that we all deal with. And how do you think we get past that, or work with that, or how should we think about these conflicts, which I think are pretty normal in life to have conflicts, but I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Thanks, Bill. Excuse me. Indeed, we have a tug of war going on in terms of providing the cheapest product, if you like, to the customer downstream, and at the same time trying to develop some ethics and some standards and so on. The issue of diabetes, for example, there's Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, and others who are also looking at it saying, how can we work with the pharma sector to address this? And one of the challenges is that they need to focus on prevention issues rather than simply providing the medicines, for example, or one group providing all the fatty foods, actually, and the other one saying, okay, I'll provide the medicine to reduce your impact of diabetes and other non-communicable diseases. So what's also happening is, side by side, as Ray mentioned that very clearly, that the issue of standards are coming in. Some, in fact, I would venture to say quite a few of these retailers are saying, we need to develop our own standards. And it's not just standards in how companies manage their labor force, not just environmental standards, but also health and safety standards. And at the same time, to try and figure out how their products can actually serve people better. McDonald's is another case in point, for example. It provides jobs for the poorest of the poor, but at the same time, some of their products are being criticized. And it applies to a number of these retail chains. There was a fire in Bangladesh about 2 weeks ago, where over 100 people died in a garment factory. The retailers got together, and I belong to a group called the Global Social Compliance Program, some of these new compliance initiatives. And they decided that they need to address this in a way which will address safety standards, but also do prevention training. Now, here's the challenge. Retailers get involved and say, we want to do that. Then the countries come back, or those factories come back and say, you owe us for what happened. So the tug of war is, how do you ensure that those factories, those garment factories, actually have the right standards in place before you go in? Where does the responsibility start and end? Whose responsibility is it? Is it Walmart's, or is it Tesco, or Carrefour, or whatever? Or is it the responsibility of those factories? Is it the responsibility of the government to have the right safety standards? Who implements them? That is now the new debate, which is actually very good, because at the end of the day, if it's a public debate, then there is some dimension of social responsibility and some of legal and political responsibility. And these multi-stakeholder dialogues are now taking place where people are saying, let's address this in a collective way, where everybody comes out a winner and not losers, and so on.
And where is this debate going on other than in the media?
So retailers, manufacturers are starting to do that in a huge way. It's not so public for obvious reasons, because there are legal issues as well. There was another fire in Pakistan about 3 months ago. That kind of, all of those things are coming to fore, because the traditional ways where we address compliance issues are human rights issues, labor laws, environmental impact, and so on. I think we're getting well past that too. And most of the big retailers and the big manufacturers either have their own, if you like, standards or regulations and rules. But they're also saying, these industry associations now are saying, it's about time we took on that responsibility. And by the way, it's not simply because they feel that they are responsible for that, but they realize it's good for business. Because the moment they stop doing that, in today's open society, consumers will put on the internet and say, don't buy it from X company. So suddenly it'll impact their sales, and therefore the supply chain and everything, multiplier effect.
I want to stay on that topic, so I'm going to skip you, Joe, for a second and come back to Ray, because you've done a lot of advocacy on sugar and other issues. Where do you see the responsibility playing out in, I mean, part of it is in developing countries. What's their responsibility to them to provide the environment where people can work in a safe way and laws are enforced and that? And what is the role of U.S. Industry, business, and government in saying that these are standards that are a minimum by our requirements to be engaged with you?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. This Bangladesh case is really an interesting one to follow because it's generating a lot of buzz, not only in the garment sector but across a whole lot of other industries and product lines as well. And it actually, in some ways, embodies the real set of challenges that we face. For example, and I was in Bangladesh when the first garment strikes took place, so I was part of the early phase of sort of developing some of the in-country standards that were put in place on around this issue. In those days, basically, you had women workers in factories, 8 stories tall. The doors were locked, no bathrooms, no breaks for lunch, forced overtime, no pay for that overtime, and there began to be a real sort of pushback globally on those issues. And today, the Bangladesh government has engaged over a number of years on these issues. The Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association became involved at the national level. They realized that if they were going to grow the industry and they were going to get the big clients in the design industry, that they had to sort of step up the standards. So there's been actually a lot of improvement in the sector. The problem, however, when you're looking at it from the point of view of the garment retailer here, is they might do everything they think that's appropriate in order to certify their suppliers, but then they're relying on this intermediation mechanism at the country level. It's in the supply chain to ensure that the auditing of those factories is accurate, up to date, being competently executed. And that's where the system right now, at least in the garment field, is still quite shaky. And I think it's also true in some other fields as well, even for the companies that think they're doing the right thing. So this is why this whole focus on supply chains and the weaknesses in the supply chains and the principles that are being applied to good practice is becoming extraordinarily important. But the good thing about it, I think, which is positive and good news, is it's also enabling all of us who sort of see these companies as these monolithic entities. It's also simplifying our ability to understand what their business practices are and where the strengths and weaknesses are in those business practices, and to take practical measures and dialogue with them about very practical things that can be fixed. And so, but it's required that we get educated about those supply chains and the complexities that are embedded in them.
Amir, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I just want to echo what Ray said. One of the biggest challenges in this field is the quality of audits. There's a mushrooming of new breed of auditors, by the way, and they don't have a kind of dare I say, a good umbrella organization where they set standards for auditing. And even if they do set standards, it's a question of follow-through. How do you train those people to understand the evolving issues, actually? And I want to just go back to a bigger issue which we're facing. We often talk about corporate social responsibility. We feel that era is dead. It's not about corporate social responsibility in the traditional way. It really is an issue of personal social responsibility, because we all have an individual and collective interest in addressing issues where our fellow human beings are able to benefit from equal rights like what we have. Rights to work, right to decent work, human rights issues, and so on. And that issue, by the way, is being addressed by people like Joe. So when he talks about addressing or buying coffee from DRC, for example, giving employment to farmers, he's not just saying, I'm doing it from a point of view that it's corporate social responsibility. It's the personal social responsibility, leadership you're showing. And that's what we want more of.
Jody, do you have a comment on that? Yeah,
Thank you. At the end of the day, there's real problems with slavery in cocoa in West Africa. And there have been laws in this country that we are not allowed to bring in products that have been produced through slavery, forced labor, etc. Those laws aren't enforced. And that's true across a wide group of products. There are more people enslaved today around the world right now than there were for the 300 years total leading up to emancipation. So the problem's growing, it's not shrinking, and ultimately, I completely agree with Amir, it's consumer responsibility. But at the same time, as a company, we don't want to say, buy our chocolate or the sky will fall. We want you to buy our chocolate because you love it, it tastes good, it feels good. You enjoy sharing this with the people you love because you feel good about everything that goes into it. That's what companies have to move towards and engage consumers. I had lunch with Raj Shah a couple years ago, and I said, I have a radical idea. Why don't you take half of the USAID budget and put that towards consumer education in the North, and try to create draw for products so that you really do have, when it comes to export, only export, so that because the investment follows. From the development standpoint, if you don't have a market that's pulling on the string, you're pushing on it, it won't go anywhere. How much money is wasted if you don't engage consumers and if we're not all a part of it? So it's a cultural shift that we're looking at, and it's not because you're being policed, it's not because we want to keep the bad guys out, it's not because we're trying to stop harm, it's because we're part of something positive. We're part of real change that feels good to us culturally, and that's really the shift. And ultimately, like in the DRC, there's no government there. When you're working in a country that is, for the most part, lawless, completely corrupt, the only way to create change is to establish political will, ultimately. If people have good incomes, they're making money, they're engaged in their communities in a positive way, and they're creating something through the hope that they have for tomorrow, they're building political will, and ultimately it's part of the change that I think is required. So let's all of us do something because it feels good.
What I'd like to ask the panel and follow up to that, and then I think we'll move on after that, but would be, what do you think the role of civil society, of the development sector should be? How do you think we should look at relationship with corporations, countries, whatever, most constructively, so that rather than an antagonistic point of view, we find a way to accomplish what we want in the most effective way? You want to try that, Ray?
Sure. Well, one of the things that's happening in many companies, and a good example of that is your hometown corporation, Costco, is there's the emergence of a very robust discussion about sustainability. And sustainability broadly defined. In other words, the idea that we as a company, or we're a global company, we're going to make investments all around the world, we're going to source from all around the world. We need to think about, can we get social license for responsible sourcing from the populations that we're sourcing from? Are we going to engage with them in a meaningful way and provide fair wages where we operate? Are we going to respect sort of the environmental integrity of the environments in which we operate? And are we going to ensure that the populations who maybe are not receiving benefit from our factory are not getting polluted water that we're releasing into the streams and undermining their agriculture? So the sustainability principle is creating a really interesting discussion in the companies at the high level, and then the managers down the line are being asked, implement this, and implement it through all of the people that supply us. And we want these values that we're talking about in the sustainability discussion to be operationalized, not to be an abstract discussion in a corporate social responsibility fora where it's all rhetoric, but there's not any operational payoff. So now what we're trying to do is figure out, how do you make sustainability, how do you get the tires to hit the road on the sustainability principles in real corporate practice? One thing I want to just mention, picking up on something that Joe said, which maybe I think is another area where, so maybe in terms of responsibility of citizens, push the companies that you own stock in to embrace the sustainability principles and actually represent them in their business models. That's number one. The second thing I think that maybe we all need to take a look at is, Joe mentioned slavery in West Africa. It may stun you to know that there are something like 6 or 7 cases of slavery in federal courts in the United States today. Now, how is that possible? Well, what we're finding is we're sort of looking at some of these corporate supply chains in the United States, particularly as they impact the work of farm workers in the United States. We're sort of seeing this phenomenon where there's so much pressure at the top of some corporations and so little appreciation of these kind of sustainability principles and principles of sort of justice and equity that they're trying to accumulate more and more shareholder value at the top. And say, in the case of produce growers, the farmers and growers are getting less and less value, and therefore the farm workers are getting less and less value. And there's been almost no increase in farm worker pay scales for the last 15 years. And so in some cases, that's produced the worst kind of behavior, which is enslavement in our own society. And the other outcome of that is, and this is a debate that's beginning to emerge in Washington and elsewhere. I was on a panel at the Brookings Institution last week, the distinguished Brookings Institution, where they had a panel on inequality. And we're talking about this as kind of a phenomenon that we're seeing increasingly in the United States. We're seeing it in China. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it in some of the emerging development economies. And it's becoming an aspect of sort of the globalization model that's in place right now, in which the shareholder value is moving to the top, but it's not necessarily a shared prosperity across the full spectrum of participants in production, retail, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we get a public discussion going about inequality, and how does that translate itself into what people talk about in annual general meetings of major corporations as part of the way they view their value chain? Equity, inclusive economics, inclusive growth. That's really that kind of shared prosperity view of the world is what's going to build a world that I think we're all going to be happy to live in and we're going to feel good about.
Either of you two want to tackle that one?
Well, the only thing that I would add is, it's a very simple math, right? If you want to buy lettuce cheap, that's an externalized cost, this issue of slavery. It's someone else is subsidizing that for you. And so that's the kind of engagement that I think is necessary in order to create change. And it's also why I feel transparency beyond certifications or audits, transparency about practices that anyone can have access to about how a company operates their business, I think is critical. And you can be profitable while doing the right thing.
Hey, Joe, let's bring this thing down to earth a little bit. And most of us in the Northwest here, we are smaller NGOs. There's a few large ones, but from a practical level, we're all saying, how do we play in this partner game? How do we find opportunities to expand our work through relationships with business? And do you have experience in that? Do you look for partnerships with other businesses? And how do you, being, say, one of the small guys looking up at, all the big players in the world, how do you see that perspective?
Well, initially, every success is an individual success. And so we look at it sort of a one-to-one. How does someone impact somebody else's life? What does that one person need? It's not, policy is important. There's a lot of larger issues that have to be tackled. But on the development side for us, we look for partnerships that can have very, very practical impacts that have relationship to our supply chain. And I won't get into some of the IRS issues around funding supply chains through donations, different problem. But one of the partnerships that we're proud of is World Bicycle Relief, where they're actually creating small economies in regions where cocoa can grow. So they're training mechanics who can go out and fix bicycles. The bicycles are required to carry goods to market. And it's sort of like having a chocolate factory open up in your neighborhood and suddenly a dry cleaner is required, or other small markets are required. Those smaller efforts have a big impact. In our case, we look for partnerships that strengthen everyone in our supply chain, which includes our employees as well, because you have to remember, we can pay a better price, but that's just really the beginning for the change that takes place in the communities. The NGO effort that we require is to provide education on family budgeting and family planning, to provide information about better agricultural practices to help increase yields of sustainable crops. Theo doesn't do that, but we provide an opportunity for the smaller NGOs to do it. So the question that I would ask everyone here who has an interest in this area is how does your expertise impact the farmer, the employee, not just a larger policy challenge, but how does that impact and how can you actually work with a company to strengthen the supply chain? Because at the end of the day, we win. The company wins when the farmer wins. And when you can articulate that for another company and say, this is how we can support the workers who are producing your goods, then that's an in, and it's a one-to-one, it's a direct impact, and it's very easy for business people to understand how that can help.
Ray, maybe you can talk as a little larger NGO. How do you see, what sort of opportunities do you look for in working for businesses, and what opportunities do you think the nonprofit sector should be looking at as they go out and try and expand their work?
Well, maybe I'll tell us a bit of a story about one relationship we have that's very practical and involves a program in Africa. We, some years ago, began to worry about the question of the security of farmers in vulnerable areas of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Ethiopia. And we initiated a conversation with the corporation Swiss Re, the reinsurance company, the global reinsurance company, about could we work together to explore whether it might be possible to create an insurance product for small marginal farmers in northern Ethiopia, in the Tigray province on the border with Eritrea, a very remote area, somewhat arid and subject to periodic droughts. And Swiss Re was interested in this because they had a couple of sort of things they were interested in. One is they're interested in, is it possible to create an insurance market in Africa with pooled risk across the African continent? And if they did do that, what kind of products would they have to develop that would be suited to that environment? So we had a dialogue about insurance in Africa for a while. And then we ended up working to create a pilot in one village in northern Ethiopia. And it involved elaborate collaboration to sort of pull this off. And just to give you a sense of the number of actors that are involved in this, we needed to figure out a way that we could evaluate crop losses in a region of northern Ethiopia and make it cost effective. So we actually developed a partnership with the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where there's a satellite imaging and technology center that can evaluate evapotranspiration at a very micro level in geographic regions all over the world. So they're collaborating with us on doing the risk assessment and the evaluation of loss in this area. Swiss Re is actually providing reinsurance for this program to cover any losses that might occur during crop cycles. We're now into our third, fourth, fifth year of this. An indigenous insurance company in Ethiopia, private sector in Addis Ababa, is actually dealing with the insurance products on the ground. They're working with a micro-enterprise NGO in northern Ethiopia to actually interact with the farmers. And there are farmer co-ops in the area that actually are the sort of the face and negotiating face for the farmers. Oxfam acts as a convener. And then the other actor in this is the government, where it turns out that in Ethiopia there's very large social safety net programs where in very, very poor areas people can actually do cash for work programs. And basically in these areas in northern Ethiopia, what we've been doing with the government is actually encouraging them to build climate-resistant infrastructure, water retention systems, terraced agriculture, all sorts of things that will increase agricultural productivity and increase incomes for those families. So what we've done is we actually have a program where poor farmers can do cash for work, building this kind of climate-resistant infrastructure in their communities, which is durable over many, many decades. They can work several days a month to pay the premiums for the insurance if they can't afford to pay it in cash. Earth Institute is monitoring the losses that might occur in crops, and we've developed for Swiss Re in effect a weather-indexed insurance product. We started out with 200 families in Ethiopia. We're now up to 14,000. World Food Program is very interested in this because they're supporting similar kinds of social safety net programs in other countries where this could be replicated. We're now looking to replicate it in Mali and possibly also in 2 or 3 other sub-Saharan countries. So it's a very interesting sort of model of a collaboration where you've got NGOs, you've got a major global corporation, and then you've got government involved, and we're developing a creative, innovative new product.
Amir, do you see, obviously we have our global corporations, but there's lots of small businesses and medium-sized businesses in this country and in other countries that are working overseas. Is that number growing dramatically, and do you see more engagement by them in terms of what they should be doing as international citizens, if you will?
Actually, that is indeed the driving force, because when you look at small NGOs who are working together here, they are also pushing the SMEs, excuse me, which are the small and medium enterprises. And the SMEs are actually suggesting that, look, wherever we do business in developing countries, we should be doing responsible business, inclusive growth approach. Thinking it from a different prism, not simply about saying, how can I make a quick buck, but how can I create real sustainability? I want to stay there in those countries, and I want to create a market there which will help also enable me to sell better. So that kind of approach is increasingly growing in trend. You mentioned about the NGOs, how they could be engaged. I think one of the things we found at the UN and in other platforms, that when you do it in silos, you don't have the possibility of greater impact. What you need to do is to say, how can we work together? And I know it's not always easy. Partnerships is really about relationships. And the other big issue about working together is, how do I forget my own turf? How do I forget that it's not just about me, it's about us working together? And once you do that, you suddenly start seeing it from a different prism. And when you do that, you actually have a greater impact. And that's what Global Washington is doing, is bringing together what is called the third sector and so on. For these innovative partnerships, you can actually make that difference.
Thank you very much. What I want to do now is ask each of them the question, to tell me the question they wished I'd asked them. But in the meantime, I want you to get ready, because we do have microphones and would like to open this up to questions from the audience. So, Amir, if I could start with you on that end. What did I not ask you that I should have today? Or what would you like to tell us?
What do you think Global Washington should do about changing the world? Just a small question.
Okay.
Yes.
Book is taking notes.
So when you really think of it, as we've talked about this, Seattle is really the home of philanthropy, home of social entrepreneurship, creativity. There are not many parts of the world, actually, even though we have Silicon Valley doing technology, but a lot of philanthropy comes out from this side. And when I say philanthropy, I'm thinking of smart philanthropy, creativity which really can change the world and has been changing the world. And there are a number of companies in the region who are actually at the vanguard of this. At the same time, I'm a strong believer we should not be adversarial with companies. So when we have a campaign, when we work as NGOs, etc., we should find a way to be inside the tent. Their tent, or bring them inside our tent. Once you start doing that, then you kind of embrace their values or understand their values, and then get them to change values based on what you think is right. So, suggestion, you create a public forum, actually, for this kind of a conversation under the umbrella of the Global Washington Initiative, where people share their ideas in terms of what they want to do, bring the private sector in, bring the Chamber of Commerce in, and then use that model to export it globally. And that's under your leadership. We'd be very happy to support you on it.
Okay. Thank you. Joe.
That's good. I like that. I think there is a lot of value for having dialogue. It's creating a sort of a safe environment for advocates, NGOs, corporations, policy folks to actually say, openly, I'm really struggling with this. I don't know how to address shareholder value while doing this other thing. I think for a lot of companies that would certainly be valuable if it really was a safe environment. But the question, I'd like to ask a question, and I'd like to take this time just to ask the crowd here and everyone in this room, if you were to have an impact, as we were talking about through our own personal responsibility. You know, I get the question often when I do presentations, isn't it more expensive to be socially responsible? And I often think, isn't that a bizarre that we even have that choice? And so if you were to tell your friends, and this is rhetorical right now, but if you were to tell your friends or build a marketing campaign for a chocolate bar or for a computer device or anything else that is telling the story about why you want these companies to be responsible or to be transparent or to have positive impact, what is that message that you would deliver? And I am dead serious. If anyone is interested in sharing that with Theo Chocolate, info@theochocolate.com, and say, hey, Joe asked me this question. I really like to know, because I think that there's some really, really smart people here who can help us educate, not just Theo, but I mean any company, educate consumers about these issues in a way that would really drive change. So I'm looking for more engagement that way. That's my question.
Thank you. Ray.
Okay, my question would be, you know, given all the sort of interest and discussion we've had about the role of the private sector as kind of the new emergent and very substantial actor in the development field, do we think that the private sector is going to solve sort of the development conundrum for the next several decades? Or do we still need foreign aid? And if we do need foreign aid, what for? So I'll try to answer that.
You'll try and answer that. I was hoping you weren't looking at me.
Well, I don't think the private sector alone is going to solve the development conundrum for the next several decades. I think it's got a role to play, but I guess I subscribe to the view that markets are morally neutral and that they need citizen action and government, some degree of government supervision to ensure that they deliver social value. And so that the idea of this kind of collaboration that's not necessarily siloed, but actually is positive and mutually reinforcing to get positive outcomes is a critical part of the equation. And I think we've got to get the balance right. And if we don't have a sufficient presence of government in these processes and sufficient presence of voices from civil society, we're not going to get the right kind of outcomes. And since we're all, since this is an American audience, I want to just maybe underline something I know that Bill has worked on a great deal, we've worked on together, which is the whole question of U.S. foreign aid and the future of U.S. foreign aid, and maybe just make a couple of quick points to you as American citizens and also as residents of the state of Washington. Number one, the United States has been historically one of the most generous contributors to foreign aid of any country in the world. We continue to provide 50% of the global food aid to these major emergencies, and we are still, in absolute terms, not necessarily in relative terms, a major aid contributor. However, I think it's also important to understand that there are forces in Washington that in the midst of this sort of budget climate would like nothing better than to sort of cut, and eliminate a lot of what is in the foreign aid budget. And there are a lot of us who've been working very hard to sustain that money because we think it does a lot of good, and it's really important for programs that alleviate poverty, that deal with crisis situations, and most importantly, and I think for the Americans, help to build markets for our products, help to build sort of the capacity of countries to grow and there to be consumers in those countries to buy American goods. So, and I think one of the things we have not done well, maybe in the development community, which I really want to underline, is we haven't told our story well about how much has been achieved through development financing and foreign aid over the last 30 or 40 years. If you look around, I started working in Latin America 30 years ago, and there were dictatorships from one end of the continent to the other. And if you go to Latin America today, we've got democracies, functioning democracies. We have the highest economic growth rates in the world. Peru is growing at 9.5%. We have educated populations. And if you actually sort of lift up the covers, what do you find? You find that American money through foreign aid was going down there, facilitating university exchanges between American universities and universities in those countries to build leadership capacity. You find that there was American technology and American know-how that was collaborating with technicians in those countries to build up their agricultural sector. There were investments in diversifying their economies away from agriculture to industrial economies. We built hundreds and hundreds of institutions in these countries all over the world that exist today as the platforms on which this development is happening. And those very institutions are what's critical for the private sector to feel comfortable in making the risks to invest in these new countries and to grow their business. So if we hadn't had foreign aid, we wouldn't have stable economies, predictability, rule of law, everything that business needs. So if you want to see that continued growth, get behind keeping foreign aid funding in the U.S. budget. Your Senator, Patty Murray, is critical to the budget process. Cover her back, support her, write to her and communicate that you want her to support foreign aid funding in this budget fight. Because basically what's going to happen is we are going off the fiscal cliff, no question about it. And then there's going to be a lot of blood on the floor about what's going to be preserved and what's going to be cut. And so if you care about foreign aid, get in early, get the message to Patty Murray, tell her you don't want it to be cut. It's very important for your region. You've got a major global health programming in this region across all of your institutions. You've got big corporations that are marketing out of here and marketing their products. This is important for your economy, and it's important for a lot of the work that you're doing in global Washington. So I just want to, Bill knows I'm an advocate, so I'm advocating, in case you haven't noticed. So go for it. Anyway.
I think, Amir, did you want to add something here?
I want to strongly endorse what Ray said.
Okay.
The real challenge is that we don't tell the story. It's not just about aid, it's about the investment side as well, which goes on. And U.S. needs to show that, look, we're doing various things around the world, and it's very good foreign policy. So I want to make another case to say to you that I think you should create from Global Washington to Global USA. And that's where you can create that platform.
Okay. Book, did you copy that down? I just want to make a quick plug for the fact that the one thing we did not get to cover today, and that is the partnerships between NGOs and universities. And Ray has had a long experience in using universities to build cases for advocacy, do research for their work, and so forth. We have some wonderful universities here in our community. And again, really important partnership opportunities for us, and they are very anxious to be of service and to be in partnership. So we ought to keep that in mind. And with that, please, I'd like to hear your questions. We have somebody here, and somebody in the middle of the room, and somebody over here.
Out in the back there too.
And way in the back, yeah, okay. So we'll get around here, just pick one, and please try and keep your questions to the point and brief so we can get as many as we can.
Good morning. My name is Romy Ruiz, and I'm actually a reporter in Guatemala for the Associated Press. So I've spent much time covering indigenous communities that work for fair trade companies and many that do not. So my question is actually directed to Joe. I think it's really important to realize that food justice continues to be an issue also in the United States, where we have a very unequal consumer market. Don't you believe that, or what progressive steps could corporations be taking to speak to other corporations? Isn't it unfair to place the weight on the consumer, considering that not many people in the U.S. would be able to spend the extra dollar on the chocolate? Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to Seattle.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, what I always say is I'd rather see consumers eat less chocolate and eat the right chocolate. And so I've been saying that for a very, very long time. I also think the Farm Bill needs to be fixed. We'll have healthy people here if the Farm Bill gets fixed in this country. So I want healthy consumers, I want strong consumers, but at the end of the day, if you're buying a cheap chocolate bar, you've externalized the cost of that to farmers in West Africa. So eat less chocolate, but eat the right chocolate. Right. No, they can. They can if they buy, instead of buying 10 Snickers bar, buy one Theo bar. And eat less chocolate. I mean, that's simplifying it.
Another question, please. Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. Hi, my name is Leah, and I'm with Days for Girls International, and my question is also for Joe. First, I wanted to say your talk is highly effective because I now have half of a dark chocolate and salt bar in my bag right now. But I was wondering, is Theo Chocolate registered as a social benefit corporation? You guys are talking a lot about all these really exciting new models, and there are a lot of really exciting financial models that are emerging. So I'm wondering what that partnership looks like more specifically. Is it just something that's built into the ethos of a corporation, or is it structured differently?
So you're talking about B Corp? Yeah, so I think B Corp is fantastic, and I think that B Corp works really, really well, especially for companies that are shifting from an old paradigm to this new way of doing business. It's something that we've looked at, and at the heart of it, our operations, I think, already meet those standards, and we haven't felt that we've needed yet another certification, because back to this issue around audits and certification, there's a lot of flaws in audits and certification. And there's an administrative burden associated with that as well, and so we've had to pick and choose. But we think that B Corp is a really great model, especially helping companies either from the old paradigm or new companies look at structuring it. And I feel like we're already doing a good job, and we're transparent so people can measure our own bylaws effectiveness however they want.
Ready with a question in the back?
Hi, I'm Kathleen Braden. I teach in the Global Development Studies program at Seattle Pacific University. And in the new partnership, I was wondering if there's a role for labor unions. I'm mindful of all of the women who did not die in garment factory fires in the United States because of unions protecting labor rights. So has the day of the labor union passed in all this? What do you all think?
Well, maybe taking that Bangladesh case as a case in point, there has been actually labor union representation from the United States in Bangladesh trying to organize garment workers from as far back as 1993. And so there has been an effort to do that. There has been, if you can imagine, resistance on the ground and efforts to kind of compromise the sort of the union organizing that's been happening, but it has been happening. But I would also say, maybe as a point of reflection, I think there's perhaps some deep reflection going on within the union movement about what globalization means for union organizing and for traditional union tactics, if you will, in terms of how they engage with companies, and whether, in fact, there needs to be new ways of doing business. I'm not in a position to kind of comment more broadly on that, but I have been in a number of meetings with representatives of the labor movement where they're reflecting on the fact that in the U.S. case, many jobs are going overseas. Many companies that are selling product here are sourcing from overseas, and there's all sorts of interesting new dimensions to what it means to be a labor activist in the United States in a global economy. And I think we have a long way to go to kind of get our arms around that and what it means in terms of how we think about organization and how we think about engaging corporations from a union vantage point.
Question over here.
Yes, my name is Pam Kilborn-Miller. I'm the program director for the Charter for Compassion that won a TED Prize in 2008. And we have a global partner network with 150 partners in 30 nations. My question is very simple. What are some of the top success factors for partnerships that have an impact, a successful impact? And that's for anybody who chooses to answer it. Thank you.
I think the first thing you have to address is the question for the other side, what's in it for me? Instead of thinking, what's in it for me, you answer the question for them. If you address that, you already made inroads. And as I said early on, it's all about relationships. It's about how you engage with people. Once you address that what's in it for me question for them, you can almost be assured that you'll have a common vision. And then implementation is easy. And by the way, the Charter for Compassion is a great organization. Thank you.
I think one of the challenges oftentimes in partnership relationships is the sort of asymmetries of power and finance and perceived advantage of some parties over others in the relationship. And what it sometimes involves is, what I think is actually a critical element is everyone has to come to the table as co-strategists in support of a common vision, as Amir is saying, and actually sacrifice a certain amount of autonomy in terms of what the outcome might be. The other element of this is, there's a journey you're on where, independent of, or a part of sort of trying to get to that common vision, is a commitment to building trust through transparency and openness about what your individual institutional agendas are. And thirdly, which is sometimes it's a very practical element, is can you work your way toward propositions that immediately can be perceived as win-win outcomes? And oftentimes you can get stuck in long-term dialogues about all the reasons why ideas won't work, but oftentimes the breakthroughs come when somebody steps back and comes up with a set of propositions where what's on the table is, this is a win for you, a win for you, and a win for you. In some ways, what Joe was talking about, where you're trying to get, everyone at the table feels like they can see the outcome that works for them.
Is this something you learned in Washington, Joe? Ray?
No.
One last question back here, thank you.
I'm Gerald Van Bell. I represent West African vocational schools, and I'm also on the faculty of the University of Washington, so I do play both roles, and it's very good to hear that. I have a question for Joe. I think some bad things happen to people at times, so your company must have been challenged with problems relating to bribery and basically political corruption. Could you give an instance of that, and could you also share how you handled it?
Where do I begin? Most of, it's interesting, there is, this is what I consider to be some of the largest crimes is not the small briberies at the borders or at the checkpoints going from one region to another with a container of cocoa. It's oftentimes the fact that there is large tax applied to a particular good that is going into the pockets of the tax collector and not for the public good in that region. In Cote d'Ivoire, cocoa is taxed at 21%. So if you're going to buy a cheap chocolate bar, the cocoa that's in there, the 21% is not going to the public good for the region that it's being taxed. In the DRC, it's 16%. There's no benefit seen as a result. So I believe that the institutional corruption of governments in some of these countries is actually a far greater crime than the petty bribes that go on day to day just to pay a toll to get to the next road. So that's my view. My experience has been that we don't pay bribes. It's not something that's done. And typically what happens is that there's enough community support for what we're trying to do and enough upside that the community sees that those bribes actually are never paid and the container is allowed to pass. I'm trying to be brief. Well, we can talk later if you want.
Please join me in thanking our
We
extraordinary...
had one more here. This one here.
Okay, well, we're a little over time. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Amir, for noticing my hand. I actually have a question for you and Ray. My name is Gladys. I'm from Zimbabwe. I work with an organization called Institute for Young Women Development. Zimbabwe recently discovered a huge mineral deposit that has diamonds, which, if carefully and properly mined, can actually go a long way towards alleviating the situation in Zimbabwe. So my question to you, Amir and Ray, is that what's your take on the certification of this diamond by Kimberley against the reports and evidence of human rights violations in this diamond deposit?
Well, I can't speak to that particular case, but what I would say is I think we made some real progress in sort of raising public consciousness about the need for monitoring these kinds of operations that I think is produced in the case of major jewelry corporations, an awareness that they want to source responsibly. That being said, I think right now there's a discussion going on about how solid the Kimberley process actually is and how reliable it is going forward. And some of us who actually were sort of part of founding that have some reservations. And maybe Amir can speak to that kind of from within the frame of sort of international diplomatic sort of channels and what the perspectives are there. What I would say maybe on the broader spectrum is that there is a very vibrant discussion going on about the role of extractive industries around the world because of the fact that in many countries, their extractive industries are generating more revenue than just about any other business on the ground. The other issue is that extractive industries now, are finding that they've exhausted the ore deposits in sort of politically safe zones like the state of Utah, for example, and now they're going into very, very risky environments like countries in Africa, the Congo, I can name any number of countries, but extractive industries are all over Africa. Chinese companies are all over Africa. And this question about impacts on communities, human rights violations is something that's very alive. Now, extractive industries is a very good case where you could see that there's been a lot of work on global norms. There's been a World Bank did an extractive industries review that sort of sets out a kind of framework that companies should follow responsibly. Tony Blair set up something called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, in which there's business, civil society, and government participation to promote the idea of greater transparency of extractive industries. There's a lot of company fora through the International Council on Mining and Minerals in London, where there's discussions about the presence of mining companies in indigenous communities and how they should be comporting themselves. And then Oxfam and a number of other organizations are engaging with companies trying to force better behavior and paying attention to precisely these kinds of egregious human rights violations on the ground in particular contexts. So I think probably that Zimbabwe case, given some past history, is one worth following. I'd have some reservations about Kimberley at this point. Amir, I don't know whether you want to pick up on that.
Thank you. And by the way, linked to that, there is something called the Diamond Development Initiative, which is the umbrella association where they look at the role of artisanal miners and how they're addressed and so on. So I agree with Ray. The Kimberley process has not been perfect, but actually it's been there. It's probably one of the only international process which exists currently to try and address some of the challenges in Zimbabwe, countries like Zimbabwe. What's happening with the Diamond Development Initiative is they're looking at how the extraction process takes place in Zimbabwe, and to see that the artisanal miners do not stay underground for beyond a certain number of hours because of the CO2 emission and so on, and how the translation process takes place and how the marketing takes place. Because Zimbabwe or Zimbabweans would not benefit under the current arrangements. The World Tourism Organization, for example, is also looking at that. There's a plan to see how because the marketing of diamonds is one of the biggest challenges actually in the region. What Ray mentioned about the Extractive Industries Transparency Association, it's actually chaired by the founder of Transparency International. And they're now starting to look at that. So within the UN, they're expressing concerns about it. Zimbabwe government has approached the UN to do a review of this process.
Okay, caught me in the middle of the nut, right? Okay, here we go. So, I want to first just thank each of you for the phenomenal work you do in the world. And I want to thank you for being with us. And please join me in saying thank you to our panel today. I think they've been extraordinary.
Thank you.